you have noticed. He has received his degrees from Harvard and prestigious institutions in Poland. And also, he has taught at Harvard, MIT, and Tufts University. And now he's almost finishing up his dissertation at the Global School. And also, he has served as a Hungarian diplomat for many years. And so, please join me in welcoming Zoltan. And over to you, Zoltan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lami, for inviting me. This is a great honor and privilege. Lami has been a friend and colleague for several years. She graduated from the same program that I'm part of right now, and where I'm working on my dissertation. And it's really a great opportunity for me to speak to you guys. So thank you again, Lami, for this kind invitation. And even if virtually, it's really great to be in Hong Kong for a few hours. As you know from the introduction and from what Professor Kim sent out to you guys, I am a former Hungarian diplomat, and I have been doing research and teaching graduate and undergraduate courses in international relations. And my original focus was, my focus was always American strategy and foreign policy, but my original focus was more on US-Soviet competition. And I did a lot of research and taught courses on US strategy during the Cold War, especially how the containment strategy was conceived by the likes of George Kennan and others. As I've been pursuing my PhD studies, I was still interested in US foreign policy and grand strategy, and those are the areas where I also worked for most of my career as a diplomat. For most of my career as a diplomat. I focused on US foreign policy. I represented my home country, Hungary, in Washington, D.C., where I was a foreign policy analyst. I was monitoring and reporting on US foreign policy and grand strategy, including US-China relations, actually. Back in the day, this was in the early 2000s, or the late 2000s, actually, 2005 to 2009. And so I've been interested in China for a long time, and I've been interested in US-China relations, and that's what I've been focusing my doctoral studies on. It's the US strategy towards China in the past 50 years. So let me introduce to you the topic of today, which is US strategy towards China in the past 50 years. And I've called this presentation The Sources of American Conduct, US Grand Strategy, and the Rise of China from Nixon to Trump. The title of the talk is very close to the title of my dissertation. And let me give a little bit of background on the title, The Sources of American Conduct. As I mentioned, I've done a lot of work on Cold War US strategy and the origins of that strategy, which go back to George Kennan, who was, similarly to Lami and myself, a diplomat turned scholar, or a scholar diplomat, or a diplomat scholar. And in that way, he's very much my role model, and I got interested in him in the 2000s. And I've written a little about him and the U.S. strategy that he conceived of, which was containment. His famous article was called "The Sources of Soviet Conduct." Kennan wrote about the Soviet Union as less a partner and an ally, and more of a competitor. And this was in 1946 and 1947, when this, knowledge was not very widespread. It's not very well known. Kennan was the first to point out a lot of hard truths about the Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union is going to be a rival, it's going to be an adversary rather than an ally. The US had the Soviet Union as an ally and looked upon the Soviet Union as an ally for much of the Second World War, where the US and Britain and the Soviet Union and China, for that matter, fought the Axis powers, fought Germany and Japan and Italy. But as the Second World War ended, it became clear to some, very few actually at the time, but George Kennan included, that the Soviet Union was more of an adversary than an ally. And so George Kennan wrote this article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, to lay down the foundations for the strategy that the US could pursue. And eventually that strategy that he laid the foundations for became the US strategy under the name of containment. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to pay homage to George Kennan and also say that we need to understand the sources of US conduct in facilitating China's rise, because that's what's at the heart of my research. So what are the main questions of my talk? And I will ask Professor Kim if she thinks I'm talking too long and we're not leaving enough time for questions. Please signal that to me. I've prepared a lot of material for you guys, and I want to run a little faster through the theory parts and get to the empirical parts, which are definitely more interesting. But I think for a lot of you who are students of international relations and political science, or thinking about choosing those fields as undergrads, I think even the theory parts will be interesting. So the main questions, the theory questions they have to do with grand strategy, and I will define grand strategy in a minute. But the first question is, what are the determinants of grand strategy? In other words, what determines grand strategy? Is it, and that's the second question, related question, is it mostly the international system as a whole? International systemic factors, international factors that determine grand strategy? Is it outside of the realm of the state to determine its grand strategy, or is it domestic factors inside? Is it factors inside the state that help determine grand strategy? And the related question, why do status quo powers often, and this is a big enigma, why do status quo powers often facilitate the emergence of rising states? So what happens, and this is the theory I'm working on, oftentimes, and this I claim has happened with US towards China, oftentimes status quo or established powers, I prefer to use now the word established great powers, end up helping the emergence of rising states that eventually over time become their own competitors. That's an enigma. That's a mystery. Why would established powers do that? And the policy question related to that, which is obviously less dry and sheds more light on the theory questions, is why has the United States helped facilitate China's rise and thereby raise a peer competitor to itself? A big mystery, and I think one of the big mysteries of our current age and of the 21st century. So, a little bit about the concept. So you will notice I will interchangeably use grand strategy and strategy. They're not interchangeable. I would like to explain why I'm sometimes using grand strategy, sometimes using strategy. So what I'm looking at is mostly strategy of the United States towards China, not so much grand strategy. Because what is grand strategy? And we have two great definitions here. The first is from the neoclassical realists' Taliaferro, Lobel, and Ripsman. And Professor Taliaferro happens to uh, teach at Tufts University, my university, and happens to be on my dissertation committee. This is a foundational work that this quote comes from on neoclassical realist strategy. They define grand strategy as the organizing principle or conceptual blueprint that animates all of a state's relations with the outside world for the purpose of securing itself and maximizing its interests. A related, quite similar definition of grand strategy comes from Hall Brands, who's a Yale trained historian and is currently at the Kissinger Center at SAIS at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. He says grand strategy is the intellectual architecture that gives form and structure to foreign policy. A grand strategy is a purposeful and coherent set of ideas about what a nation seeks to accomplish in the world and how it should go about doing so. One element is missing from these two otherwise outstanding definitions, and that element is long term. Grand strategy is long term. So, if I wanted to summarize the elements of what makes grand strategy, one is that it's long term. Obviously, from both definitions, you can see that it is about the state's relations with the outside world. I also like to say that a country's place or role in the international system. And third of all, it's grand because it encompasses all of a state's instruments for achieving those goals. What are those instruments? And this is what distinguishes grand strategy from military strategy. Those instruments are military, but not just military. They're diplomatic, economic, informational, and so on and so forth. So military strategy is about using the military tool for political aims. Grand strategy, on the other hand, is the strategy that uses all of a state's tools, from military to diplomatic to economic, for achieving those political aims. So I hope that makes it clear. And then why I'm using strategy mostly in this paper is that what the U.S. behavior means towards China for us in the past 50 years, it's less the grand strategy. It's less about the U.S. overall strategy towards, its international place towards every country in the world, rather than the strategy specifically about China. But that strategy is now becoming grand strategy because China is the main competitor of the United States. So strategy towards China becomes grand strategy because China becomes central to U.S. foreign policy and grand strategy. Let me run through quickly the three cases that I'm going to present to you today. The first case is so these cases are actually periods. So as I said in the beginning, I'm looking at U.S. strategy towards China in the past 50 years. So 1969 to 2019. And I've divided this time frame into three periods. The first period is the first case study, which is the late Cold War period. It's the 1969 to 1989 period. It's also the period of U.S.-China de facto alliance. This is the time for the U.S.-China alliance, an explicit alliance between U.S. and China. And I will tell you why that was revolutionary at a time. The second period is U.S. strategy towards China in 1989 to 2009. I also call it the post-Cold War period because this starts at the end of the Cold War, 1989, 1990, 1991, when the Soviet bloc collapses and very shortly the Soviet Union itself collapses. So the U.S. and China lose their common enemy. So U.S.-China relationships changes, and obviously U.S. strategy changes. I say changes, but I'm going to argue that it doesn't change as much as it should have according to international systemic factors. And the third case that I'm looking at, the third period, is actually the past decade. So 2009 to 2019, the Obama administrations and the Trump administration. And I will explain why that is my third period in a minute. Back to the theory. So I'm testing three theories of foreign policy or grand strategy um, on my three cases. What I'm trying to find out is which of these three theories explains US strategy towards China and the shifts in US strategy towards China in the past 50 years the best. My first theory is Kenneth Waltz's balance of power theory. And those of you who are taking IR, majoring in IR, studying foreign policy will come across Kenneth Waltz's neo-realist balance of power theory, certainly, because it's probably the most influential theory of the past 40 years. My second theory that I'm testing is what we call Innenpolitik. That's a German word for inside politics, domestic politics, domestic coalition approach. It actually comes from German historical literature. Actually, German historians came up with the first conception that foreign policy is determined by elements inside of the state. That's Innenpolitik. And the other approach, the counter approach, is that foreign policy is determined by factors outside of the state, so international factors. That's Außenpolitik. And before we had a discipline of IR in the sense that it's come to be in the 20th century. It was historians who did IR, who did international relations. And so it comes from German historiography, essentially. So Innenpolitik domestic coalition approaches mean that it is certain domestic coalitions of interest groups that largely are responsible for determining a state's foreign policy or grand strategy. And my third theory is a theory that I'm working on constructing, and I'm constructing this on based on neoclassical realist theory and also classical realism. And I will explain how my theory reconciles these two other theories, Waltz's balance of power theory and domestic coalition theories. So let's look at the theories, how they explain the phenomena that we're looking at. So how they explain grand strategy or foreign policy, the determinants of grand strategy and foreign policy. So this is structuralism or neorealism. This is where Kenneth Waltz made his mark by putting forward his balance of power theory. So both Waltz's theory and other neorealist or structuralist theories, it's in the name, they're structural. They consider the international system as having a structure, meaning the international system's structure, the way it's structured, determines the limits and constraints and opportunities of states' behavior. So the international system, in other words, largely determines states' foreign policy or strategy. How? What we can see is this graph presenting it's a so-called deterministic, systemic deterministic view. It's a simple and simplistic view for the purposes of parsimony, so that it's simple and easy to understand. Systemic stimuli on one hand, they largely determine policy response on the other hand. I know you couldn't see my hands. want to make sure you guys see my hands. So maybe I'll come here. Thank you. I hope this will become clear as we go on. My second theory is obviously liberal theories, innenpolitik theories, specifically domestic coalition theories, which are on the bottom of the current graph. Domestic factors are the domestic factors are the independent variable, and grand strategy is the dependent variable. Those of you who are familiar, probably on the master's level mostly, but possibly also those of you who are undergraduates and studying political science are familiar with the terms independent variable and dependent variable. So independent variable actually causes the dependent variable, right? So that the arrow signifies a causal relationship. So on the bottom, you can see my second theory to be tested. That's domestic coalition theories or innenpolitik theories, where domestic factors directly determine grand strategy or foreign policy. On the top, you can see what we just discussed, the neoclassical realist theory or structural realist theory, including Waltz's balance of power theory, where the international system directly determines grand strategy or foreign policy. Where are my hands? Still looking for my hands. Here we go. Okay. Finding my hands. Okay. No jujitsu. No, this was just trying to figure out where my hands can be seen so you guys can follow my gestures. And then, as I said, I'm constructing a neoclassical realist theory or a theory based on classical realism and neoclassical realism. And these are some of the foundational works on neoclassical realists. Actually, the most recent but very important works by Talia Farrell Lobel and Bripsman. And neoclassical realist theory has the advantage of reconciling systemic approaches with approaches that deal with domestic factors. So neoclassical realist theory is systemic, so they agree with neorealist, structural realists that the structure of the international system largely determines what leeway states have in determining their own behavior, but they also factor in both domestic and ideational factors. This is the graph that tells you, the research design of a neoclassical realist theory. So as you can see, systemic forces are the independent variable. Internal factors and dynamics are the intervening variables. And foreign policy making, grand strategy, foreign policy are the dependent variable. So here we have an approach that reconciles systemic approaches with the presence and influence of internal factors, domestic factors. And this is a more complicated way of showing neoclassical realist theory, where systemic stimuli on the top are the first signals that come into the foreign policy executive. It goes through perception, decision-making, policy implementation. On the bottom, you can see the so-called internal or domestic factors that neoclassical realists have identified. And on the right, you can see on the top the policy responses, which could be foreign policy, grand strategy, war, peace, cooperation, or conflict. My theory, as I said, will be based on neoclassical realist theory, and it addresses the question of how and why established great powers facilitate the emergence of rising states that may over time become peer competitors. I claim that that's what happened to US and China. So the key variables of my research, dependent variable is US strategy mostly, as I explained before. It's not yet grand strategy about China, not in the 70s, 80s, 90s or 2000, but it becomes slowly part of the grand strategy as China is the main competitor of the United States. The independent variable is international systemic factors. So whatever happens in the international system really affects U.S. decision making. And third of all, intervening variables. I chose one intervening variable among the many possible intervening variables, domestic variables. I chose domestic coalitions. I will explain what I mean by domestic coalitions. Looking at the time here, so what I'm working on is a typology of strategies for established powers towards rising states. I've identified three strategies. The first one is engagement strategy. This is when the status quo power, the established power, seeks to ally, engage with the non-threatening rising power. And there's two conditions. One is there are no threatening powers. There is one threatening great power in the system. And the second one is this strategy is supported, at least not modified, not skewed by domestic factors. We will see that U.S. followed this strategy for most of the past 50 years. At least the U.S. clearly followed this in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s, it's shifting to sticky strategy. It's my term for it. It's kind of a funny, joyful term. And I define sticky strategy as the shift of the status quo power from engagement towards balancing is hampered, slowed down by domestic factors, specifically domestic coalitions, when there is only a fledgling indirect challenge from the risers. So what we will see when I present my case studies is that the U.S. Foreign policy executive, the decision makers, they understand that systemic signals would indicate that the U.S. needs to start balancing against China. This is post-Cold War. This is the 90s and the 2000s. Clinton's administrations and George W. Bush's administrations, and already Bush Sr.'s administration. But there are several factors from domestic coalition to ideational factors that I will also talk about that slow down this process. So the U.S. Is engaging in the 70s. It should move to balancing according to neorealist or systemic theories, but it kind of got stuck. It sticks to its previous strategy where it's trying to move away from it, but it can. And finally, what I call realpolitik strategy is what I believe the U.S. should have pursued from at least the George W. Bush administrations, at least from the 2000s, but ideally should have shifted towards during the 1990s. It's a balancing strategy. The established power balances internally and or externally against the rising power when the rising power directly challenges the status quo power and opposing domestic factors are absent. All of this will make a lot more sense in 30 minutes. Let me show you how the different strategies that I've identified in my theory correspond with the different periods that I'm looking at. So let's look at this 1969-1989 period. The polarity of the international system is bipolar. U.S. strategy towards China is engagement. U.S. strategy and Chinese strategy towards the U.S., they jointly define the character of U.S.-China relations, but U.S. strategy obviously plays a big part, and the resulting character of the relationship is cooperation. They were de facto allies. And the hypothesized determining factor here is the international system. In 1989 to 2009, that's my second period, the international system is unipolar. A U.S. strategy is a sticky strategy. It's trying to move from balancing to from engagement to balancing, but it kind of gets stuck. It sticks to engagement. As a result of both the U.S. strategy towards China and Chinese strategy towards the U.S., the resulting character of U.S.-China relations is a mix of cooperation and competition, more cooperation, but competition is emerging. And the hypothesized determining factor here, again, the theory's biggest contribution is which factor largely determines Iran strategy or strategy. And I say here it's the international system and domestic coalitions. And I will explain why. 2009, 2019 is my third period. That's the past decade. I think we're past the label post-Cold War period. I think we're in a new period. The polarity of the international system is shifting towards multipolar, bipolar. It's a realpolitik strategy that the U.S. pursues. As a result, there's more competition than cooperation, but that's also a result of a more assertive, more realpolitik Chinese strategy under President Xi Jinping, and the international system is the hypothesized determining factor. And we can return this, table and the theories into questions if anything is unclear. So before I launch into the discussion of my case studies, the different periods, the last thing I want to do is tell you what I hypothesize, what the different theories hypothesize or predict, what the different theories predict, to say, in a more simple and clear way. I want to tell you what the different theories predict about U.S. strategy towards China. So if we just took the theory and applied it to, an imaginary chessboard of the international system, what would be their prediction? So we start with neo-realist, structuralist theory by Kenneth Waltz, his balance of power theory. Again, it's structural. So the international system structure determines largely state strategies and foreign policy. And so in the first period, Waltz's theory would predict a balance of power with China, so engagement with China and an alliance with China against the Soviet Union. In the second period, Waltz's theory would actually predict a strong shift from engagement to balancing against China, because China is no longer an ally. There's no common adversary in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is gone, and China is a competitor, clearly. And in this third period, Waltz's theory would predict full-scale U.S. balancing against China. On the other hand, this is my so that was the zero hypothesis. This is the first hypothesis. What I'm thinking will explain U.S. strategy. This is my main alternative hypothesis. And the baseline is that Waltz's balance of power theory explains a lot about U.S. strategy towards China, but it doesn't fully explain great power strategies in general. Domestic coalitions strongly influence the foreign policy establishment, how the foreign policy establishment interprets international systemic stimuli, and domestic coalitions mitigate international systemic effects. So interest groups. You should think about domestic coalitions as economic interest groups. I have found evidence of an influence of an internationalizing domestic coalition through my research. And my theory, as I mentioned, strives to explain the lag in the U.S. shifting from an engagement to balancing strategy in the second and third period. So one of the main puzzles within the topic that I'm looking at is, why did the U.S. start balancing against China so late? So we're trying to explain the time lag in the U.S. starting balancing too late. And as I said, domestic coalition theory is my third or second or third alternative theory here. With the hypothesis, it's the second hypothesis, zero, the first and the second hypothesis. It's a less likely alternative. This theory would predict that an internationalizing domestic coalition would override systemic stimuli for the U.S. balance against China in the second and third period, and they would push for engagement. obviously, this once again, both neorealist theory and neoliberal theory like this, they are deterministic theories. Um, uh, Neorealist theories are systemic determinism, and liberal theories like domestic coalition theory are domestic deterministic. So now we're launching into the story that I want to tell you. Not just the theory, we're talking about real world problems and real world phenomena. So, my first case, as I said before, is US strategy towards China from 1969 to 1989. So, I kind of created the different periods so their timelines would even rhyme. So they always start with a year that ends with a 9. So it's 69 to 89, but it actually matches historical events. So I think we have this picture on the next slide, a little smaller form. This is President Nixon with Chairman Mao Zedong, President Richard Nixon of the US and Chairman Mao Zedong of China. He's the founder of Communist China, Mao Zedong. And what's interesting about the Nixon-Kissinger opening to China in 69, from 69 to 1972 and onwards, is that the US and China were sworn enemies before. So in 1949, the Chinese communists led by Mao win in the Civil War, and the revolution is victorious, and they take over the government of China, the central government of China, and they become the new state, and they call it the People's Republic of China. From 1949, this was again a communist state, so the U.S. Looked upon it suspiciously. Also, the U.S. was in alliance with the China that existed before, which was led by nationalist forces with Chiang Kai-shek and Kuomintang, who fled to Taiwan and established the Republic of China in Taiwan. But they're now, exiled, so to say, in China, in Taiwan, and China is ruled by communists. So the U.S. and China from 1949 to 1972 are sworn enemies. Thomas Christensen wrote Useful Adversaries about this. So my idea is that Christensen covered 1949, actually mostly 1949 and 1958, but the period between 1949 and 1969, and I'm going to cover the next 50 years. So those of you who are interested in pre-1969 or post-revolution U.S.-China relations, Thomas Christensen's Useful Adversaries. So it's interesting that a lot of people think that U.S.-China rapprochement, reconciliation, was invented by Mao, and a lot of others think that it was invented by Kissinger. The meeting of great minds is what happened in this event, because Mao, Nixon, and Kissinger, all three of them, in the late 60s, started thinking about the necessity for an alliance between U.S. and China, between the United States and Communist China. Why? Because the U.S. The U.S.'s main adversary was the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union was a communist state, the U.S. considered Communist China also an enemy, which even Thomas Christensen says that was not necessarily the rational decision. And so both sides discovered that there is a lot of value in exploring a potential partnership between them. Again, the U.S. Had looked at the Soviet Union as its main adversary, But China was allied with the Soviet Union, you could ask. Well, China was allied with the Soviet Union until the 60s, when a number of factors pulled them apart. One was ideological. Mao's communist doctrines and the Soviet Union's official doctrines quite diverged over time. And the other factor was that China and the Soviet Union are neighbors, and there started border skirmishes in the late 60s. In fact, around 68, 69, the two countries got to the verge of war with each other. So that provides a great opening for the Nixon administration and the leadership under Mao. And all three leaders, Nixon, Mao, and Kissinger, start playing with this idea. And then Mao starts laying the groundwork at home. And Nixon publishes an article in Foreign Affairs during the 1968 presidential election, when he mentions the idea of the U.S. Exploring an alliance with China, or at least normalize relations with them. And then in 1968, President Richard Nixon is elected president of the United States, takes office in January 1969. The exploration, the diplomatic negotiations, diplomatic preparations start, and they culminate in Henry Kissinger's secret mission to Beijing in 1971. He travels there under the disguise of a visit to Pakistan, which was a U.S. ally also back then. Kissinger at this point, so Kissinger is called, invited by Nixon when he becomes president to be his national security advisor. And Nixon and Kissinger really laid the groundwork for U.S.-China alliance. In 1972, and this was absolutely shocking to world public opinion, President Nixon visits Beijing, meets with Mao. Henry Kissinger is with him, and they start this fantastic adventure of the U.S.-China de facto alliance. Again, sworn adversaries to de facto allies in a couple of years. In 1973, the opening of the liaison office in Beijing by the United States. Again, this was very important because the U.S. wanted to balance the Soviet Union, balance against the Soviet Union with the help of China. And historic events showed that that idea was correct. The alliance with China did help the U.S. counter the Soviet Union, although it obviously wasn't the only factor in the outcome of the Cold War. So I'm going to spice the case studies up with some quotes, and this comes actually from Henry Kissinger himself. He's in a peculiar position of both being a real-time participant of these events, shaper of these events. He's also a scholar who's thought a lot about these events. Kissinger was an academic. He was a professor of history at Harvard, but he got involved in foreign policy making. He says this was a strategy of transforming the two-power world into a strategic triangle. That's what the U.S., Soviet Union, and China relationship was called from then on. It's a strategic triangle. And the Nixon-Kissinger opening, in Kissinger's words, was successful as it managed to create a major incentive for Soviet moderation by achieving a dramatic opening to China. So again, the goal was rapprochement with China, but also some kind of rapprochement with the Soviet Union, at least moderation by the Soviet Union. This is Nixon and Kissinger, and two other quotes, because this is probably the most important period, most important administration in terms of U.S.-China relations. Nixon and Kissinger were ushering in the most sweeping changes in the United States foreign policy since the idea of containment had first emerged 2 decades earlier. Again, we're back to containment. John Lewis Gaddis, a Yale historian and one of the scholars on grand strategy, he is the biographer of George Kennan that I mentioned in the beginning, who conceived of the strategy of containment, and he writes this in his landmark history of the Cold War, strategies of containment, and he says this was the most sweeping change in U.S. foreign policy since the idea of containment emerged. And then he adds, the Nixon administration's revised assessment was that American security required maintenance of a global balance of power, and that China was a crucial element in the balance. This clearly confirms Waltz's balance of power theory that great powers do internal and external balancing, and the external balancing takes the shape of forming balances of power with other powers against other adversarial great powers. This is Nixon and Kissinger, and the same strategy continued in the Ford Kissinger years. Obviously, Watergate happens. Nixon, before he would be impeached, he resigns, and he passes the presidency to his vice president, Gerald Ford, who retains Kissinger as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. Henry Kissinger is the only U.S. diplomat, U.S. Leader ever to have held both positions at the same time, as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. He was incredibly influential in the Kissinger and Ford years and beyond. In 1975, also a historic visit by President Ford to China, second presidential visit to Communist China, and this administration marches on towards normalization. And normalization happens under the Carter administration. President Carter is very lucky that all of this legwork had been done by the Nixon and Kissinger administrations, but he supported this strategy. And on January 1st, 1979, that's 41 years ago, the establishment of diplomatic relations, so full normalization of U.S.-China relations occur. And in the same month, the new leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, visits Washington. So Deng comes to power in 1978, the previous year. There is, after Chairman Mao's death, there is an interim period of internal struggles within different Chinese leaders, and Deng Xiaoping emerges. He's a reformist who was sidelined in the late Mao years. He's a reformist, and he turns out to be a visionary. He's a reformist that starts economic reforms right away in 1978, 1979, and he also is the first. Chairman of the Chinese Communist Party to visit Washington, D.C. in his capacity as Chinese leader. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan happens, and this actually brings the two sides much closer. And in 1980, and this is very important for my study and for our discussion today, in 1980, the U.S. grants China most favored nation status. And another quote here, this time from Michael Green, from a great book called By Providence. It was Nixon's focus on a new balance of power in Asia, to which Jimmy Carter would later turn in the face of Soviet expansion. By expansion, he means Afghanistan. The U.S. didn't want, and neither did China, want Soviet troops in Asia. The Reagan administration focuses mostly on countering the Soviet threat, but continues the Nixon Kissinger conceived strategy of engagement with China, forming, continuing with the alliance with China. In the 1980s, under President Reagan, the U.S. keeps granting China the MFN, the most favored nation status. It's the most beneficial trading status for a foreign country, granted by the U.S. And again, Michael Green, by More Than Providence, the same quote extended to the Reagan administration. He said it was Nixon's focus on the new balance of power in Asia to which Jimmy Carter would later turn in the face of Soviet expansion, and that Ronald Reagan would refine and resource to push the Soviets out of the Pacific. And that's what happens, and we know that the Soviet Union in 1989 withdraws from Afghanistan. In 1989, the collapse of the Soviet bloc happens, and by 1991, the Soviet Union also collapses, and the Cold War is won by the United States. That leaves the United States and China at a totally different juncture. This is my second period, 1989, 2009. And the first administration is obviously George H.W. Bush Sr., who continues Reagan's engagement strategy, even though circumstances changed. What are the circumstances? Circumstances are that the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc collapsed, and there is no common adversary for U.S. and China. So the common enemy is gone, and therefore the U.S.-China alliance breaks up. China starts becoming more of a competitor, and what's really surprising here, and not really in line with Waltz's balance of power theory, is that even though China both becomes more competitive, more of a competitor, and also hardliner state control in China under Deng. So Deng actually approves of this. In June 1989, we know that Tiananmen Square massacre happens against the protesters, many of them students of your age, and that prompted the U.S. Congress to want to revoke China's most favored nation trade status, and President Bush surprisingly reject this following lobbying by business groups. And this is what I call the domestic coalition effect. There was a domestic coalition from the 80s until today that pushed for continued engagement with China, even though the international systemic circumstances would have called for at least more of a mixed strategy of balancing and engagement. And I think the most enigmatic two administrations are the Clinton administration and the George W. Bush, the Bush Jr. administrations, in terms of this continued engagement with China, because China by then is clearly more of an ally of newly independent Russia, and they oppose a lot of things that the U.S. wants to do in the international system. Again, in the UN Security Council, China and Russia band together. Still, the Clinton administration doesn't shift the boat of the United States towards balancing. In fact, their overall grand strategy, not just the strategy towards China, the grand strategy is engagement and enlargement. They want to expand the community of democracies. They also heavily rely on liberal interventionism, humanitarian interventions in Bosnia, in Somalia, and Kosovo. But China is clearly rising. If economic data don't support the claim that China was rising in the 80s, it was rising, but China now is clearly rising. China starts becoming an externally oriented economic power, trading with the entire world. Of course, one of the prize markets for China was the United States. Most favored nation status actually secured that market for China, and policymakers are preoccupied with liberal interventionism. They're also preoccupied with business groups pushing for engagement, and the Clinton administration ends up paving the way for the next step of facilitating China's rise economically, which is China's membership in the World Trade Organization. And here's a quote characterizing the Clinton administration's strategy towards China from Steve Levine. President Clinton's decision to dealing human rights from most favored nation was a decisive moment in the evolution of his administration's China policy. Note that the same thing happened with the George H.W. Bush administration. They were balancing between economic, business groups, and human rights groups on the other hand. But the balance always tilted towards business groups. Levine continues, it demonstrated the enormous political impact of China's dynamic economic growth in the 1990s on thinking about China in foreign capitals, including Washington. So domestic coalitions, economic business interest groups, but economic interest of the U.S. also pushed the U.S. towards continued engagement. And again, mysteriously, enigmatically, the George W. Bush administration continues the same engagement policy and the same support for China's integration into the world economy. An interesting anecdote about this is that in late August 2001 and early September, the George Bush administration was working on a new national security strategy in which they were going to have a harder line on great power challengers, and they were going to signify China as a strategic competitor. This would have been a first. Remember, 2001 in September 11th, the terrorist attacks happened, and they completely deprioritize China in the eyes of the U.S. administration. And the war on terror is adopted as the new grand strategy. And under this grand strategy, the U.S. starts wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and follows through with the Clinton administration's policy of trying to help China join the World Trade Organization. This was almost single-handedly a U.S. achievement, a U.S. Goal, and the U.S. was instrumental in getting China join the World Trade Organization. And China actually pledges to adopt a lot of policies of liberalization, both political liberalization, economic liberalization. Economic liberalization only remains partial in the next 2 decades. Political liberalization, as we know, never takes off. A momentous visit in the strategy of engagement with China is April 2006. Another anecdote, I was a Hungarian diplomat covering U.S. foreign policy and U.S.-China relations in April 2006 in Washington, D.C., and I actually covered Hu Jintao's visit to Washington, D.C., which was a remarkably important chapter in U.S.-China relations. And this is when the two administrations agree on establishing the strategic economic dialogue that fills up with even more content under the next administration, which is the Obama administration. And a quote about George W. Bush's administration. Mind you, this is a book by Paul Bluestein, who covered U.S. Economic policy and world economic policy for the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, and now just came out a couple of months ago with a new book called Schism, China, America, and the Fracturing of the Global Trading System, in which he chronicles how the United States helped China's integration into the world economy and the world trading system. And he has a great chapter on the George W. Bush administration. He also published a article drawn from the book in Foreign Policy, in which he says, looking back at the Bush administration's handling of these problems, it's reasonable to wonder why a more forceful approach wasn't taken. Several reasons emerge from a granular look at the process. Among the most important is persistent optimism in Washington that China would continue to shed the vestiges of Maoism and open its markets. Again, a ideational part of an ideational factor influencing U.S. strategy is the belief that China will liberalize, will open its markets. And China, as we know, doesn't liberalize. China keeps the state subsidies. China keeps devaluing its own currency. It keeps forcing foreign companies into joint ventures if they want to invest in China. China continues, I'm talking about the 90s and the 2000s, to infringe on intellectual property of foreign companies, and also engages in simply stealing know-how and economic espionage. And Bluestein says Bush resisted entries to come down harder on China. So the president, actually lobbied by business groups, but the president himself pushed back within his administration on more balancing efforts in the economic trade spheres. Bush resisted entreaties to come down harder on China, and he took considerable heat as a result. And so we come to the past decade, U.S. strategy towards China in 2009, 2019. It obviously starts with the Obama administration. They start out pretty much like their predecessors, the George W. Bush and the Clinton administrations, more engagement than balancing. But this is really the first administration that starts in earnest some kind of balancing as China. That balancing starts more in the second Obama administration. So in 2013, it's called a pivot strategy. So they take on the military facet of this competition between U.S. and China, because China at this time also starts becoming more assertive militarily, especially in the South China Sea, but also building on the economic gains of its rise, its miraculous rise throughout the 90s and the 2000s. China starts investing in its military, and so the pivot strategy was aimed at shifting the focus of U.S. troops, the U.S. military, away from Europe and Middle East and towards the Asia Pacific. So another quote: the elements of balancing and deterrence grew more pronounced with the 2011 announcement of the administration's pivot to Asia, but the primary emphasis of Obama's strategy has always been engagement. This is from Aaron Friedman. So engagement remains the main part of the strategy, but some kind of balancing in the military realm happens. Another quote, that was from Colin Duke from the Obama Doctrine. And then we come to the current administration, the Trump administration. There's President Trump with President Xi Jinping. And this is, again, the first U.S. administration to take on the economic facet of competition. Again, what I've tried to discuss in my presentation today is that it is really the economic rise of China that the U.S. supported, and this is what's propelled China to great powerdom, to a great power status. The Trump administration starts the trade war with China. They conclude it's a truce in the trade war. They conclude the phase one deal in December 2001. December 2019. So 5 months ago. But we know that Trump is quite ambivalent towards China. He sometimes comes down hard on China. The hardliner in the administration is Vice President Pence. He's the one who delivers the hardline messages. And President Trump wants to have a good relationship with President Xi, and he often praises President Xi and his government. So let's go back to our, hypotheses, the theories. What have we seen in terms of the theories? Which theories have been verified or justified exemplified by our case studies. So again, Waltz's balance of power theory was the first theory. So he predicts that the U.S. Would form a balance of power with China in the first period, and he's correct in that. That's what happened. Although I want to explore in my archival research and also exploring the data about how much weight did China add as a balancer against the Soviet Union to the United States? How much of value did China add to that? But Waltz's theory would predict a similar strategy. It would predict a shifting from engagement towards balancing the second um, period. This is what doesn't happen. This is what happens with a great lag, a time delay. And in the third period, it would predict a full-scale balancing against China, which again doesn't happen, as we saw Obama balance against China militarily, and the Trump administration balances against China in the economic sphere, which is probably the most important, but it's still not full-scale balancing of military, diplomatic, and economic facets. My neoclassical realist theory will take next after domestic coalition theory. Domestic coalition theory would predict an engagement strategy in all three periods. Obviously, that's also a little too deterministic. It's a little too far. It's the other end of the spectrum. Waltz is one end of the spectrum, and domestic coalition theories are the other end of the spectrum. So they're on the extreme, and I want to reconcile these two extremes with my theory, which is more towards Waltz's balance of power theory, but it takes into account domestic coalitions, the business interests that can, or any other interest. It could, with other cases, not U.S. China, could be any other interest, but usually it's business economic interest that push a established power towards continued engagement when the circumstances would call for more balancing, more containment. So this is what we've seen in the first, period. We saw engagement, an alliance with China. We saw mostly engagement with some competition, but not much balancing by the U.S. administration. It was mostly balancing by China, actually, that resulted in the competition part of the relationship. And then in the third period, we do see partial balancing. So Obama and Trump actually moved towards what international systemic factors would call for. And I believe what would be in the U.S. national interest, because grand strategy is supposed to advance the national interest. And I think in this case, because China is a competitor in every realm, in every area, I think the U.S. should be balancing against it in every area. And it only partially balances now in the economic realm, which is probably the most important. So, in spite of all the criticism that the Trump administration has received, their approach to China, I believe, has been in line with what is called for by international systemic effects and what is in the national interest of the United States. So obviously, these were the questions that we posed. What are the determinants of grand strategy? I think we come down on the side of international systemic theories. We say it's mostly what happens in the international system outside of a great power or any country that has a lot of weight on what the grand strategy is of a country, but it's not a perfect determiner of grand strategy, because we see that domestic factors do mitigate international systemic effects. Why do status quo great powers often facilitate the emergence of rising states? I try to explain this. Again, this is a work in progress. I try to explain this mostly with domestic coalition factor and ideational factors. I'm currently focusing on domestic coalitions as the main factor, but I'm also keeping ideational factors in my little drawer because I think ideational factors might have played a big part. So I need to explore that more as I'm delving more deeply in the archival holdings about this relationship. And conclusions, obviously, are that the U.S. followed an engagement strategy mostly throughout a 50-year period. There's a lag in starting balancing against China. And as I mentioned, it's domestic coalitions and ideational factors that are responsible for that. But what's on everyone's mind, of course, we've talked about, U.S. strategy towards China from 1969 until 2019. But that was last year. It's April 2020, and we're in the disaster, absolute chaos and disaster that is COVID-19. And obviously, what happens in the world on a global scale, and especially what happens that links China and the United States, will matter for both U.S. strategy towards China and Chinese strategy towards the U.S. It will matter for U.S.-Chinese relations, and it will matter for the international order. These are the two great powers in the system right now, the U.S. and China. China now, and I think for about the past decade, can be considered and should be considered a great power. I think we have more of a bipolar or multipolar international structure right now, and whatever the U.S. and China do matters for the international order. So COVID-19, which affects all of us, all countries in the world, and has affected China and the U.S. significantly, really matters for the international order and U.S.-China relations. I would say that China is once again, and I think this should be clear from my presentation, I think China is once again playing a great game, playing the game very well. I think it should be clear from my presentation that I think Chinese strategy has been much more effective in the past 50 years than U.S. strategy has been. I think Chinese strategy has served the Chinese national interest better. The U.S. Strategy has served the U.S. national interest. Once again, we see China as a great and shrewd player of this international game. COVID-19 was, and all evidence, currently available evidence points to this. COVID-19 originated from Wuhan province of China. It originates from China. China completely mishandled the early days of this pandemic or the epidemic back then by suppressing information, by lying about it, by covering up, by arresting dissidents. But China also has come around. In due time, they started with very effective measures, lockdown measures, testing, contact tracing, travel bans, and so on and so forth. And to the detriment of the United States, they've started a propaganda operation to cover up responsibility for COVID-19 and to share responsibility with others, to murk, to blurry Chinese responsibility, and eventually to cleanse themselves of this responsibility. Because I think China's mishandling of the situation really ended up throwing the entire world in chaos. But China, again, has played the game very well by spreading misinformation about COVID-19 originating in the U.S. And on the other hand, the U.S. has completely mishandled COVID-19. We can see today we have 850,000 cases in the world. I think that is not more than any country in the world. It's more than all the other countries. It's almost as many as all the other countries combined. Today we have 2.5 million cases worldwide. We have almost 1 million cases of people contracting COVID-19 in the U.S. We have about 40,000 people who have died from COVID-19, a lot more than died in Italy, Spain, or China, which was hit hard first. China seems to be out of COVID-19, but there could be a second wave. The U.S. is absolutely in the middle of it. I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, which is not the third largest state. Actually, it's a very small state compared to other states, but it's the number three state with infections and deaths around the United States, which is very alarming. And it shows you that the northeast of the United States has been hit hard by COVID-19. What does it say about what does this all mean for the international order? I think China got a big hit by COVID-19. China is already free fall economically, and China's growth had a big dump already in the last quarter of 2019. I think the U.S. and the world economy is definitely going into recession. I think for now, I wouldn't say that either the US or China will come out on top from COVID 19. So far, I would say both have gotten big hits, but I think the US is getting a bigger hit for two reasons. One is the mishandling of the pandemic within the United States, and the second is that there is no US leadership. China wants to assert soft power and international leadership by shipping a lot of equipment, protective equipment to other countries and helping them fight this virus. So far, China has managed to balance out its early and large responsibility for COVID-19 by playing the game very well and by increasing its soft power, while the U.S. is totally internally focused and even internally has mishandled the crisis. So I think that's what I wanted to say. And I don't know if Professor Kim or you guys have questions to ask or any comments.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting presentation. And I think that the puzzle is really interesting. So basically, the United States should have balanced against China, checked the rise of China after the end of the Cold War, but didn't do that. And so why basically your contribution to the literature is the second part, the explanation of the second period using the new classical theory. Do you guys have any questions? Any questions? Comments? Oh, yes.
Someone
Doyoung, go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Doyoung and I'm a student from the University of Hong Kong. So first of all, thank you very much for today's talk. And I think it was very interesting to observe how the U.S. strategy toward China changed over time, from Nixon to Trump administration today. So there are two questions that I would like to ask. So first, it's very similar to what you just said about the COVID-19. So how do you forecast the effect of COVID-19 on the U.S. grand strategy towards China and the power dynamic between the U.S. and China? I mean, in fact, I think these days more and more people are now saying that the power dynamic may move from the West to the East in the post-COVID-19 era. That ultimately points out that the U.S. hegemon will gradually decline. So considering these current states, do you think China, I would say, aspiring hegemon, will finally take over the position of the U.S. In any scenario and become the sole hegemon? And so if so, then what do you recommend as the ideal U.S. strategy toward China as a countermeasure? This is my first question.
First question. Okay. That's my research assistant, by the way.
Oh, great. Well, nice to meet you, Dayan, and thank you for your question. Thank you for joining us. Great question. My mentor, Joseph Nye, has a new piece out in Foreign Affairs about the effects of COVID-19 on the global order. And he cautions all of us to not draw too large conclusions from what we know now, because he said it's too early. And I tend to agree with him. I think it's very early. He also actually argues that the COVID-19 crisis will not change the international order. Maybe it will not change the international order, the nature of the international order, the overall structure of the international order. I think it will change a lot of things. I agree with Professor Nye that it's very early to tell, because even though China has seemingly gotten the virus under control and the crisis under control, um, the global crisis, the global coronavirus crisis, has not even reached its peak. Although numbers have been coming down both in terms of new cases, and new deaths in the past couple of days, but they're still very high. And the U.S., which is now the epicenter of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, has not reached its peak, although the numbers have been stagnating or coming down in recent days, but the peak for Massachusetts and for New Jersey and for New York, these three states, is still days or weeks away. The peak in Massachusetts is predicted to be April 26, 28, so in 2 to 4 days. It could be around that time in New York and New Jersey. So we can't really see a lot of the trends that COVID-19 will generate right now, because we're not out of the crisis. But here's my take. I think COVID-19 will generate a global recession, the like of which we've not seen. The unemployment numbers in the U.S. are a lot higher, 10 times higher as ever. There are more unemployed today in the U.S. than there was during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and also after the global financial crisis that started in 2008. Both China's economy and the U.S. economy have been in free fall for months. China's economy has been declining. The growth has been declining since the last quarter of 2019. So China's crisis already started. China's heading into recession. U.S. is heading into recession. The EU reported zero growth for the last quarter of 2019. So the global slowdown or recession was already coming last year, as a lot of us were worrying about it. But the EU is definitely heading into recession. All of this means that with the Asian economies definitely also heading into recession, we're going to have a global recession, the likes of which we've not seen. That's number one. Second one, we need to see how COVID-19 affects China and the U.S. Obviously, they're the two great powers, but they've gotten big hits. I don't agree with the predictions that you mentioned that China will become the number one power, or China will become a global hegemon like in 2021, like in a year, or that there will be, because of COVID-19, there will be a complete shift of power from the West to East. That shift has been taking place since the end of the Cold War, with China's rise, with India's rise, with obviously the East Asian tigers, the miraculous. Before the rise of China, that was the rise of Japan and Korea and Singapore. So, the weight of the international system has been shifting towards the East for a while. I don't think that COVID-19 will, be the determining factor. And finally, U.S. and China, if they want to remain competitive with each other for the hegemony that you mentioned, they have a lot of housekeeping to do. First of all, we don't know how the the authoritarian flavor of a lot of the measures in China after the first outbreak of COVID-19 will go down. We know that there's a lot of dissent within China. We know that dissent because of COVID-19 and the suppression of information and the suppression of dissent. We don't know how that will be resolved. We also don't know how the question, the dissent in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, will play out. We know that China wants its own system to be in place both in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and we saw with the protests in Hong Kong that there is a very strong civil society opposing this. So China has a lot of problems. China also has a very big problem with its healthcare system. That's part of why the initial outbreak, spread so quickly across China and across the world. And the U.S. has the same problem. So they both have great housekeeping tasks, a lot of homework to do. I have been saying this for a long time. Joseph Nye has been saying this for a long time. Michael Beckley from Tufts University has been saying this for a long time, that China has a lot griever, a lot deeper weaknesses, and the U.S. does too. But China needs to confront those weaknesses. What I have also been saying is the U.S. can only, and this is my answer to your question about U.S. strategy. I don't think it's just, obviously I focus on U.S. strategy externally, but balancing, according to Rawls at least, and according to all the neorealists and the neoclassical realists, and I think the neoliberals would also agree with it, balancing is both external and internal. It's one thing to to balance externally by, for example, the U.S. strategy should be now to forge even closer relationships, partnerships, alliances with Asian allies, Asian partners. Obviously Japan's, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. The Philippines is still de facto an ally. Australia, to have a balance of power in place in Asia, to keep China in check, Indonesia, a lot of the countries that China has disputes with over the South China Sea. But internal balancing is absolutely imperative for both countries, and especially for the U.S. The U.S. is on top. I do predict with Joseph Nye and Beckley and others, it will stay on top. But the U.S. can only stay on top if it does its housekeeping, if it does its homework. I've lived about 11 years in the U.S. now. This time around, I've been here for 5 years. I'm coming up on 5 years in June, in Boston actually, and I've seen all the problems that this country has, the U.S. has. The U.S. has a lot of internal problems, and a lot of those internal problems have come out very prominently in the COVID-19 crisis. The first one is governance. There was no national response to COVID-19 because of the nature of a federal government, but also because of how the different parts of this federal system work together, not very well. It does, have a lot to do with how the Trump administration works, how well they work, and how well they handle crises. But it also comes down to how much power and how much competence there is on the state level and the local levels. So first is definitely governance. There needs to be a lot of thought put into how to make, for example, a national response to a war or a pandemic possible. Second of all, the healthcare system. The healthcare system is broken. And it was, to a lot of us, it was surprising that Bernie Sanders didn't come out on top, probably because of his own mistakes, because he had a very strong healthcare message, and the and the person who came out on top in the Democratic primaries was Joe Biden, who didn't have a strong message. But maybe that is to the detriment of the Democratic Party, because healthcare is definitely one of the factors that are part of this U.S. homework or U.S. housekeeping. And there's a number of other problems. I do believe that the U.S., and this is my final point on this, to your question, very important. I think the U.S. is squandering an opportunity to show leadership and to continue U.S. leadership with the COVID-19. But that trend has been happening since the Obama administration. I mean, I think retrenchment from U.S. global leadership position started with Obama, but it accelerated under Trump. And I don't think it's serving the U.S. national interest. I think the U.S., if it wants to be first, if it wants to be America first, I think it needs to be continuing to be the global hegemon and to be the number one great power. Only can they do that if they fix the internal problems and they continue their alliances with traditional and new allies and play an active role of global leadership in the international scene, which they're not currently. I think COVID-19 will have a lot of important consequences for all countries. I think governance is in definite crisis all over, not just in China and the US. I think governance in general has failed. Global governance has obviously failed because there is no such thing. There should be some kind of global governance, but national governments have also failed in handling this crisis and protecting their own citizens, which is their number one responsibility.
So actually, the time is up. But if you have one quick question, and if you, Jolson, can answer pretty briefly.
Hello, Mr. Feher. I'm Laura. I'm also a student from the University of Hong Kong. So first of all, thank you for the presentation, which is a very critical perspective on your neoclassical theory, which is very insightful for providing us a new perspective to the U.S.-China relationship. My quick question is that I'd like to address the third period where you say that there should have been a full-scale balancing by U.S. against China, and that economic means alone through a trade war may not be enough. However, my query is that given the closely tied connection between the U.S. and China nowadays, will it be that the U.S. will have equally more to lose by launching a full-scale balancing, or if not more losses comparatively?
Thank you, Laura. Nice to meet you. Thank you for your question. Thank you for joining us. I think that's a great question. So obviously, the U.S. Trade war with China has raised a lot of questions. I've studied it myself, and most of the experts in trade policy and political risk actually say that the direction of U.S. policy is correct. The tools are not necessarily correct. So tariffs and actually the undermining of the world trade system, which, by the way, the United States established after the Second World War and during the Cold War and after the Cold War with GATT and the WTO, the U.S. has been undermining the system that it itself established, a system of free trade globally. So tariffs might not be the best tools, but right now, at least one administration tried to balance China economically. What you're asking, I believe, has to do with U.S.-China interdependence in the economic sphere, which is quite large, and this is the result of decades of trading with each other, investing in each other's countries, having joint ventures, having a lot of supply chains in each other's countries. I think interdependence overall helps keep this competition and this relationship peaceful. So I'm not expecting. So war is always a possibility. I'm not expecting that war is inevitable between U.S. and China. Obviously, trade and investment is key to keeping relations peaceful. There's another side of this. The other side of this is interdependence also creates vulnerabilities. We've seen this with Huawei when President Trump banned U.S. exports of technological companies in certain in certain areas, including hardware, including operation systems from Google that Huawei was going to use. And we've seen this with with other companies as well. China's technology sector is currently very reliant on the U.S. And the U.S. also wants to prevent creating further, for example, national security vulnerabilities by this interdependence. So this is obviously they need to tread very carefully. But the fact is, and when I say U.S. should do full-scale balancing, and I'm not using the word containment, which I know Chinese commentators really really don't like. That's like the one thing that the Chinese foreign policy decision makers and commentators don't want the U.S. to do. But part of it is containment, and I'm advocating for U.S. balancing against China because China has been balancing against the U.S. for the longest time. They were balancing against it diplomatically and politically, opposing almost every U.S. military operation, intervention, international operation in the U.S. Security Council, United Nations Security Council. They've banded with Russia on a lot of these international issues. They've shielded Iran and other rogue states from and North Korea. We know that from U.S. and Western criticism. They've allowed the North Korean regime to survive. We know that China is greatly responsible for that. That's definitely a series of pokes to the West and especially the U.S., which North Korea considers an enemy. China has been building up its military, which is still inferior to the U.S. military, but has grown in capability and capacity and technology significantly in the past 15 years, especially since the taking of office of Xi Jinping. They've been arming China. They've been arming the Chinese military, the PLA. They have the maritime militias, fishermen's militias. They have nuclear the nuclear weapons since 1969. And China has been obviously balancing against the U.S. economically by growing very close to being as strong economically as the U.S. and also building parallel structures to the U.S.-led international structures. For example, AIIB, the Asian Investment Bank. While the U.S. stands idly, the U.S. Negotiated the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then President Trump withdrew from it, even though that would have been a way to balance against Chinese economic power in the Asia Pacific. And a lot of us also think, I personally think, that the U.S. should have joined AIIB. So I think decoupling is the term that they use for reducing interdependence between the U.S. and China. Decoupling is going to be very, very hard because the two economies are so intermingled, intertwined. They're grown so close to each other. But at the same time, China was never wary of using political, military, and economic balancing against the U.S. I think maybe in some sectors interdependence will grow, and in some sectors interdependence will wane, so as to decrease vulnerabilities of both countries. But I think the U.S. needs to match the balancing of what China has done in the past 15 years. Thanks, Laura.
Well, thank you so much, Sultan. I think your presentation was really interesting and highly relevant to what my student and I have been discussing just last week. We conducted a policy exercise simulating conflicts between the U.S. and China in the South China Sea, and we discussed a lot about the impact of COVID-19 in international order, and so it was really nice to hear your perspective. Thank you, guys, for coming. It's pretty late here in Asia, and then thank you for asking great questions. So hopefully, I hope that you finish your dissertation and turn it into a book, and then come to Hong Kong New for a book tour, book talk. Thank you, guys, and have a good day and have a good night.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. It was a great discussion. And it was great meeting you guys, even virtually. Hopefully, there'll be a chance to meet in person.
Yeah, that would be great.
Everybody stay safe and healthy, okay?
You too.
Bye.
Bye.